for me, that summarizes this whole conversation, because you're leading with sound. There's some really obvious touch point with your users that you can utilize. Hello and welcome to the Hear Me Out podcast. We are a creative music agency helping brands use sound strategically. It's very, very interesting. And we have helped brands with a combined revenue of over £1 billion to use sound to unlock value that only sound can.
Straight into it, George. I like that. Normally there's a little bit of, hello, how are you? How's your day going? But that's fine. We've almost spoken to each other all day, so we know all of those things. We're not pretending like this is the first time we've met for the day.
Tell me what we're talking about, Luke.
Well, George, what we're talking about today is we are episode 8 of 10 in our first series, and the first series is titled 10 Misconceptions About Sonic Branding. And today, George, we're going to be diving into the misconception that is, we don't need to think about sound right now.
Liars. Well, that's what we're unpacking. What are you saying? Do you think it's a misconception?
I think it is a massive misconception. Do I think it's a misconception? Am I doing this right? I think you need to think about sound at the very beginning.
So it is a misconception.
It is a big misconception. Yeah, it is a big misconception.
I believe so. And I think we should try and challenge ourselves to see if we can convince ourselves otherwise by the end of this episode. And if we have, then we should shut down Hear Me Out and close the agency, because we don't need to worry about sound anymore.
Finally, sound is irrelevant. I suppose, is there any other industry or anything else in your life where sound comes first? Where you think about sound first? You know, like
my alarm clock.
Yeah, okay. There you go.
You asked?
No, that is true, though. Yeah, there is something there. But anything you do in your life, like, do you think, I think if you're going on a road trip or something, it's very usual to be like, what are we going to listen to? I'm going to put together a playlist type thing. And so you are thinking about that before you're necessarily thinking about what am I going to see on the drive, or how are we going to get there type thing. So I guess there's that, which comes first, but I can understand why people think it, I suppose, is a good place that I think we should start, because it isn't necessary.
Put yourself in the mind of a team that have been set the challenge of like, what campaigns are we doing this year? And you've been challenged with a TV campaign. Where would you start? You'd be thinking director, visuals, who've we got? Like, let me get you going in that direction, because that's where my brain goes to. Yeah.
And where would you start? And I suppose we didn't, because we're on episode 8, we think everyone knows. But if you're just listening to this episode, when we talk about sonic branding, we're talking about, from our perspective, sonic branding is anywhere a brand uses sound. So if you haven't listened to episode 1, which is the misconception of sonic branding is just a jingle, you should obviously go back and listen from the beginning, because they're incredibly informative and, most importantly, humorous and entertaining beyond belief.
Yeah. I think we tricked ourselves into thinking we were now pros at podcasts, and you've reminded us that we still haven't set the foundation.
So sonic branding is any time a brand uses sound, whether that's on an ad, whether it's their sonic logo, whether it's in store, whether it's on apps, whether it's at events, anywhere. So when we're talking about sonic branding, that's what we're talking about, and the power of sound within that. So yeah. Exactly. But it would be interesting, to your point, George, in terms of the campaigns, like ads or whatever, when you're starting it, there is, like Quentin Tarantino, he's famous for building scenes around sound as well, and having a song and it being the impetus. So there is one of those things where sound is such an inspiration, but yet when people start to put together campaigns or initiatives, that we commonly come up against the response of, we'll think about that next. We don't have to think about it right now. There's more important things, air quotes, if you're listening and not watching.
Yeah, and I think the first campaign that really brought it to my attention as, I was going to say tactic, but that makes it sound cheap. But, as a strategy that proves that it works is Pot Noodle, the Unilever brand. And I don't know if we talked about it on the podcast before, but I know we've brought it up in a few conversations. And I had it in another conversation this morning. I was chatting with a creative director, and we were thinking of all the instances where sound came first and the impacts that it had. And one of the biggest returns of investment for Unilever brands, all the Unilever brands, was this Pot Noodle campaign.
Yeah.
And for anyone that doesn't know, it's like got a 12-second slurp where someone's like eating this pot noodle. And that's all you can hear. And everyone around the office is looking at each other like, what on earth is that noise? And then it's a woman stood in the kitchen eating a pot noodle. And then she does a little tap, like a little on the pot at the end, which Unilever figured out, or the brand team figured out through research, was an act that every real loyal, user of the product,
pot
noodleite would do, is do this 2 taps to get the last little bit of the pot noodle substance
as they're
out.
pouring it, or
yeah. So when you get to the very end, you sort of drink what's left, and then you do a little tap on the end. And anyone that has had the experience will know that so subconsciously. They probably won't even know that they're doing it, but I thought that was a genius level of insight.
Yeah, really.
And really, what it makes you question is, would they have even got to that point if they started with the visual, if they started with who's going to be acting in it and celebrities, etc.?
Well, didn't they start that way to begin with, though? And it wasn't working.
Yeah.
And they did a bunch of sort of visually focused or visually led campaigns, didn't they? And then, so it is an interesting thought experiment in terms of like, what is so important to the brand? And it is that sound, isn't it?
And there was a level 2, which I thought was even more genius. So that ad did incredibly well. They knew they were going to get a lot of backlash for it. Complaints, people saying this ad is disgusting. The whole internet went literally spit back. The whole internet was like, kicking off. And their backup plan, already filmed, already done, already strategized, because they knew they were that adamant it was going to happen, was that they then replaced the slurp with different sounds. And I think initially it was 30 different campaigns, iterations of the same ad went out, but it was targeted to certain people's demographic. This was only on social media this time, but targeted to, like, if you were a Formula One fan, you would be hearing car sounds instead of them drinking. So it sounds weird. And the concept of it was like, did it work? Or if you were, a family with a newborn, you'd hear crying baby noises instead. So it was very targeted to, I don't even know how they do that on the back end, but however the distribution happened, obviously is looking into, when you say something near your phone and then suddenly you get loads of Kit Kat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's that technology, I guess, that way with distribution. But the next level was still considering sound, and how could we then hyper target audiences? So whether or not you like the idea or not, it was one of the biggest things that Unilever have done in terms of campaigns recently. And to our advantage, it was the power of sound that kind of made all that happen, I guess. So it's awareness, I think, is probably what we're alluding to.
And I suppose it's interesting to stay with the pot noodle, the slurp example, for a little while longer, is how much money would they have saved if they had given sound the same level of respect at the beginning of the conversation. This misconception is we don't need to think about sound right now, which by its very nature means we'll think about it in the middle / usually at the end. So I'm curious as to if they were to quantify that initial investment, time in trying to produce an ad that used the visuals predominantly at the forefront. And then if they'd just entertained the idea, maybe somebody suggested it right at the beginning, but they just got overruled. Maybe, then when the first one wasn't working, they were like, let's do the second one. But, it will be hundreds of thousands of pounds that they spent on a missed ad to begin with. Massively. And I actually think, without spilling into a later conversation, a later episode, I like doing a little spill, actually. Come back for episode 9, where we're going to be talking. Such a tease.
It is a tease, but I think it's worth mentioning now. It all stems around the conversation of like budgets and why things get pushed back, and it's people's understanding of sound. Unless you're speaking to a sound agency where we can spitball ideas back and forth on how sound could lead the conversation, lead the strategy, lead the creative. How are you ever going to think about it? And we've got friends that are in,
of course,
creative world, running huge brands that are like, if I'm honest, in fact, one of the brands we work with, they were like, I didn't even think to come to you guys, and we already work with you. So it's not that it's an intentional move. I think, your brain, people's brand, whether you're in branding, marketing, etc., your brain will work in a certain way. And if sound isn't the way that it leads, which for us, sound leads the way, then how are you going to know to even question it? And I think that that actually leads to why partnerships in sound are, I think, becoming more important.
And I think it's really indicative of the time as well. So many people are visually led because the biggest advancement in technology has been screens, and it's been availability to screens, etc. Whereas if you were to go back to like the 50s and the 60s with the ad men, Madison Avenue, a huge part of those campaigns were radio. And so it would always sound like whose voice, what's in the background, where are we going to put them in what environment type thing. And I reckon at that point, although it wouldn't have been as high a priority list as what we're going to put on the billboard and in the magazines, etc., there would have been a very real discussion at a very high-ish level, I would imagine. And I know I'm just projecting here as to how it sounds, because so many people would just be engaging. I think that's the hard thing, is because now it's very rare that people are engaging. Well, it's not with the radio, I suppose, but it's less and less that consumers are engaging with brands on just an auditory level of just sound. And that's why I think it's natural for sound to be, relegated slightly in the list of priorities because of that.
I think as well, what's really interesting, you reminded me of that 76% of people consume whilst doing other things. So whether or not that's watching TV whilst you're on your phone or doing the ironing or whatever that is, we live such busy lives now compared to 30, 40, 50 years ago. Like, it's always on the rise of like how busy we all are. And there's some amazing stats even to like how much later people have kids or get married, or like, and it's not because of like necessarily just financial restraints. It's because people actually are busier in life. So the idea of throwing something else in there, I can't remember. I can't remember who was on the podcast, but I was listening to a podcast the other day about, just some crazy stats on how much distraction we have in the world now.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. I think though it's an interesting point, because I don't think people are busier. And I think you sort of touched on it there. I just think people's attention, what would be the right word? So their sphere of, like, if every human has a sphere of attention, what you're exposed to essentially, let's say, would be your sphere of attention. That is just getting busier and busier and busier with two screens, radio on in the background, billboards, everything, and just the manicness of it. And I think that's what makes it feel like it's so much more of the world's a faster place, essentially. And I think when the world's a faster place, you have more in it, which just generally makes people feel more exposed and saturated, I suppose. And I think that's the main thing, because people's lives aren't busier. Like in the 50s, people still dropped their kids off at school. People still worked full days. People still came home and they still went out with friends, and they still, did things on the weekends with friends or with their kids or whatever. And they still have holidays and work stresses. Like all that stuff still existed, but they just weren't on a bus on the way home looking at their phone the whole time. They were with their thoughts, or they were reading a book or something. Like they had more switching off that they were able to do, I think, to reset.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I wonder if the right framing then is the world around us is busier.
Yes.
Rather than our lives.
I think that's the perfect way. I think the world around us is such a busy place now. And again, that's one of the positives about sound, is that it's such a great way of grabbing that attention. Like, I don't think it should be abused, because I think that giving people that space is something that's really important to them. So it's sort of a bit of a paradox that I'm saying. Yeah. But sound is a great way to jump in and to carve out your own little bit of space there, as well as with your visuals as a brand.
How do we cut through this noise? How do we speak to really specific people? How do we combat the 8,000 pieces of information that we on average have contact with every morning alone? Like, it's ridiculous amounts of information. How do you cut through all the noise through a world that's shifting so quickly and dynamically, and that's all a good thing, but it makes marketing and branding so much more difficult.
And that's why I think it's such a misconception in terms of, we don't need to think about sound right now, because as you've just said, it's so impactful when you think about it as, if somebody's looking at a piece of video content, it's images and it's sound. And I think it's impossible to say, well, the image is so much more important than the sound. So if you're starting to think about the image, you should be starting to think about the sound almost at exactly the same time. And we've done lots of posts on LinkedIn, like go over there and connect with both of us if you haven't, where we show clips where, you know, the sound has changed on something that you know and love and just the huge impact that has. So I don't think anyone can really argue against the fact that sound doesn't have such a big impact, which is why it's so weird when people think that sound, the decisions about sound can be put off until a later time.
I was trying to think about all our other senses then whilst you were saying that. Is it just, so when we're trying to cut through the noise, and like to the reference, the 76% of the time, you know, we're consuming other things. So you'd imagine a podcast would be an easy solution to that. So whilst I'm driving the car, I always put a podcast on. That's like, I enjoy it, and I'm doing something else at the same time. So sound is very practically great in the sense of utilizing moments when we're doing something else. But I was trying to think, you know, from a brand point of view, really it's about utilizing senses so that you can still be getting someone's attention in some kind of way whilst they're doing other things. And I think sound is very good at that. Whereas visuals is a bit harder. You know, if you're watching what you're doing whilst you're ironing, you might burn a finger or you might put a hole in a shirt. But does the same apply to smell is what I'm thinking? Like, are the other senses applicable, or is it just
not
sound and visual is convenient?
Because I think, it's a weird one because, you know, when you were saying that, I was thinking about touch, but you're only really getting any sort of haptic, tactile response when you're from a product, when you're using the product, you know, like,
or like fashion when you're in a store.
Yeah. Or, you know, I mean, there is the flip of that of like, I really like my gilet, and every time I put my hands in my pockets, I'm like, ooh, they're lined with fleece. That's great. I really like this. But
Luke
if I'm just here,
sorry,
I'm just assuming everyone's watching. Because, you know, who listens to podcasts? But when I'm just sat here talking, I'm not thinking, oh, my gilet, the touch of the inside of my gilet pockets is so nice. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Because I'm not experiencing it at the time. And so I think that's why visuals and sound have such a high impact. You know, like a piece of art, you can be in a room and you can look at it and you'd be like, oh, wow, that's a great piece of art over there. And you can be listening to someone talking, thinking about that as well.
Yeah, but I think to your point of, you were saying how technology has evolved and it kind of like leads the way, you know, as screens become smaller and more portable on our phones, etc. And the power of that, obviously it makes sense why we've moved in that way. But now, like this podcast now, we're like AirPods in our ears. It's so easy now to put an AirPod in your ear. It's very rare you'll walk through London or a main city and you'll see more people without them than with them now. Most people have something in their ears. So it's like even the excuse, there was a chap who started a conversation the other day who was saying, you know, nobody listens to anything with the sound on their phone. And I was like, well, actually, we're moving back into that world where sound is predominantly on now on social media, etc. Like, I don't know if you're the same, but if I'm walking around or I'm on a train.
Yeah, I never, if I'm on social media, I would say 75% of the time I have my AirPods in listening to it because that's how it's designed to be consumed.
Nowadays it is, yeah. And it wasn't that long ago. You know, we're only talking a handful of years ago where most people did listen to it without sound on and we had to put captions on everything. But I think people still think that's the way. And it's not. Who were we speaking? We were speaking with an agency and there was 4 of us on the call and someone made that point of like, you know, most people listen without the sound on. And then in that call, 3 out of 4 of us listen with the sound on most of the time. So, and she was like, I never thought about it. I always had the sound off. So
yeah, it's a weird one. I don't understand that. I would never, but again, that comes from like anytime in my life, there's a visual, like moving image on a video, I expect there to be sound. I didn't grow up watching silent movies, or I didn't watch a movie and think, I'm going to turn the sound off and just watch people on the screen. Like, who does that with a movie? Why would you do it with content? And so just to come back to the misconception for a moment. Yeah. So if it is a misconception, when should brands, in your opinion, start to think about sound?
I honestly think from day one, when you're thinking creative and thinking strategy, like everyone will have a session where you'll sit down and be like, right, what's the starting point of this? What research do we need to do? What ideas have we already got?
Yeah, definitely.
I think I honestly can't, I honestly don't know why it wouldn't be involved in that kind of conversation, because what I'd like to think is, like, a few years down the line, most creative directors won't be saying, let's start with the sound or let's start with the visual. It will just be like whatever ideas are coming out between the team, there will just be sound versions of ideas in the mix.
Yeah, and I think it's such an interesting tool for inspiration, because you could be sitting there talking, you can be like, oh, hey, I've got these sketches, like, what are we thinking about colors of visuals? And you'd be like, oh, cool, let's put this playlist on, or let's have some music on in the background. And somebody could say something, or it could be making you feel in a certain mood, or it could inspire a certain color to come into your head or whatever. And I think that's an interesting use of sound, as opposed to, well, we got to figure out what this sounds like right now, thinking, why don't we use sound to help push the project along, which arguably people will do anyway if they're in a studio or something and there's music going on in the background or whatever.
Yeah, I think we should tell people about demoitis. If you don't know the term demoitis, I don't know where it comes from. It's the word that we use. But to that point, I do think people consider sound enough to put a song in place for when they're doing, like a sketch of a TV campaign, or maybe a sketch of social media. But then the team will sit with that track so long. Then later on in the process, they'll start pitching it out. Let's say the advert gets filmed. We see it probably 9 times out of 10. By the time it arrives with us and they're like, we want a song, like, this is the reference. This is well, we want it to sound like this.
Yeah.
They've edited the whole rough edit to that song. The director and the whole team are so ingrained with that song that realistically, no matter what we do, they want the song they've already put in place because they've heard it so many times. Yeah. It's like when you listen to a song on the radio and you go, this is awful. Why am I listening to this song? Like, turn the radio off. But actually, if you hear it 10 times in a row, you start to like the song. We've all been there. We've all got to that stage where you're like, oh, I do actually quite like it now.
I think it's 7 times scientifically proven that you need to be exposed to something before you actually start to, or before you change your opinion on it.
So imagine if you've heard it 100 times.
Yeah, but okay, so now you've completely gone 180 degrees on the whole misconception, because what you're saying now is that if you think about sound too early, then you can get stuck on something.
Well, no, I guess what I'm saying, and
not be able to think outside of it. And like, also, I guess I would also counter that with, at what point when they were doing the mock-up did they even start to think about sound? Because if it takes you 2 months to do a mock-up, and then just before you send it out to people, or you're thinking about sound, then you put sound on, you're still thinking about sound quite late. Or is it a different, and just to throw one more in there before you jump in, or is it a different framing of how people are thinking about sound? Not like, oh, let's find a song. Maybe it needs to be like, let's figure out the tempo, the tone, the emotion, etc., that we want to be portrayed in this.
Exactly that. I'd say there's 2 answers to that. So I'm not saying, I think people do put sound into place, but I think we built Hear Me Out off the back of brands always will have a sound. It's just whether or not they're conscious of how they sound. And so, directors pulling a TV campaign together, most of the time, and I'm saying this confidently because this happens to us a lot, they will have put a track in there that hasn't really considered the brand. It's just considering that specific one piece of content, whether it's TV campaign, whether it's social media content for a series or whatever. Very rarely has a whole strategic conversation / plan been made to get to that track. It's almost, for want of a better phrase, but it puts the point across. It's almost selfish of the director because they're just thinking, this is the vibe I want to create. And I've been hired for this job. They trust me in my direction, but they're not being hired on a strategic level, really. They're being hired on an artistic level. So really what brands are doing is they're putting their brand persona into the hands of an artist and expecting them to like nail it and speak to the right people. Now, very experienced directors will be very good at doing it kind of semi-subconsciously. But how many people have actually been like, is this track that's in place like relevant to us? Is this speaking to the right people? And I think that's why those placeholder tracks get put in place. It could be wrong for the strategy and for the demographic because they've listened to it so many times. Like it's felt right by the time that they get to locking in the sound.
Well, and that's the thing. If you don't have a strategic overview of how you use sound, then if the sound is good for the advert, then it's a good choice of sound. But I suppose you could counter all of this entire episode in terms of like, is it a misconception, that you don't need to think about sound right now? In an ideal world, you don't need to think about sound right now because you already have a strategic overview.
Yeah.
You've already worked with a creative music agency who have said, this is how you sound, so that then when it comes to the visuals, you don't even need to think about it because you can just be like, well, this is our sound strategy. Which part of it is this ad fitting into as in terms of the wider strategy, et cetera? Sorry. Where's this ad fitting into our wider strategy? And then what part of our sound strategy helps support that to move it forward? Great. Here we go. Done. Sound is sorted. One less decision to make. Thank you. Hear me out. You're the best agency in the world.
But I think that's like probably the most likely scenario in terms of where we would like the industry to get to.
Yes,
but in terms of use case, the flip side to that is the conversation where there's more ambition around the sound leading the way of the campaign, such as the pot noodle we started the conversation with, or, Coca-Cola, for example. Everyone knows the sound of a Coca-Cola, but how much attention has been given into the quality of the recording of the Coke. I actually know for a fact that they over carbonize a Coke specifically for when they're recording like the sound of TV campaigns, because everyone knows it so well, but the way a microphone picks it up is very different to how the human ear picks it up. It's a very conscious whole process of making sure that Coke sounds in the adverts as like fizzy and delightful. Yeah, exactly. Cause that is the sound of the product that makes everyone go, oh yeah, I fancy a Coke now on ice in the sunshine. Whatever your happy place is with Coke, it kind of comes down to the fizz, which is something we haven't really talked about on the podcast, which is product sounds. It's not one for this episode, but that is the level that brands go to. So how does the sound of a fizzy Coke lead that campaign? And they think about it. Yeah.
That's the interesting thing, is that sound isn't irrelevant, because there is a part of the conversation in a development of a product, or there should be, in the sound. Like, what was it? Was it you that was talking about the really loud crisp packet?
I don't
What was this? Who were we talking to this?
Was it a video?
But
we might have tagged one of ourselves into it.
I can't remember who it was, but it was basically a brand, and they came up with a new packaging that was all recyclable, etc.
It
was
biodegradable.
It wasn't Doritos, but it was somebody like that. And they just got endless complaints because the packaging was so noisy. So
it was something like the equivalent of a plane, not a plane taking off, but they said how many decibels it was. And it was like the equivalent of someone like shouting at you. Like you couldn't have a conversation at the same time. It was that loud.
Which is interesting, because it's like they've thought about the environmental impact, but then it hasn't then influenced the sound of it. But, people are thinking of these things, in every term of engagement with the product. So the sound is considered, but then is it just because it's a different team that's doing it, and so they don't have the awareness of it? And, to your point with the director that I wanted to make, that is why having brand managers and CMOs that understand how they should sound, been made aware that they can have a strategy around it, will then mean that they can help guide a director, to be like, it needs to fit within these realms. You can pick from these different aspects of our sonic strategy, but it's got to hit one or more.
Yeah. And some brands just have it on a plate. Excuse the pun, but like pot noodle, they quite literally have like such a distinct sound. When you think about it, it's like, oh my God, it's genius, because it's so obvious. It's almost staring you in the face of like, use the sound of me, and so many brands have that already.
Yeah, Doritos and people like that do it. Yeah. They make a huge thing of the crunch. They're like mega heat waves, spicy ring piece, whatever it is. Like they always have a big part in their ads where, it's like a granny eating it because she's so wacky and zany, and the crunch is always a huge part of it. Yeah. So it's a genius one for pot noodle.
And I think they're very, to wrap up on this, I think they're very obvious use cases, but I actually think it's quite interesting how deep you can go into it. We've been, what's the right way to say it without giving this away? Because I can't. We've been thinking about how like nature can lead the way in product sounds. Maybe the nature around creating the product can be the thing that makes the sound of that campaign or whatever. It might be a much deeper level of connecting to it. By it, I mean connecting to the end result. So it might not be as obvious as your product. The thing that you do has a sound. It might be like how does the user make a sound when they're using the product?
I think the pot noodle one is
something else.
The pot noodle one is quite fortunate for them because it's also a divisive and somewhat humorous sound that gets created when people do it, and so it has an immediate impact. You know, it's like,
Here's a good one that I want to do this. So if DJI are listening, I'm going to put it out in the world. If somebody else nicks it, I'm coming for you. DJI, when you turn on a drone, goes ding. It has like this little noise that's really distinct. It's like a beeping noise. And every type of drone, no matter how expensive, professional or amateur and small it is, makes the same noise. If you are a drone user, you will know that sound very well. I would love to see DJI at the start of every piece of social media content, at the front of every advert, at the front of every video they make, have that sound at the beginning. And I don't mean like with some B-roll footage. I mean like even if it's straight into somebody talking, just have it on somewhere in the background of that start of the video. Because everyone doom scrolling on social media that uses a drone will hear that and go, me, that's my world. I know about this. What is this? I want to stop and watch it. Just that split moment of catching attention. I think for me, that summarizes this whole conversation because you're leading with sound. There's some really obvious touch point with your users that you can utilize, and they've got it on a plate like there. But I checked all their social media, I checked everything, and they never lead with the sound that their product has.
Do they use it in any of it? In any of the content?
I haven't found anything. No, I haven't found anything. But it's so
we should make one and send
well
it to them.
crafted.
Do they have a visual logo for it? Because when you say that makes me think of lights on like a little drone or something, like 3 lights next to each other, like ding ding ding, with just 3 lights. I could imagine a black screen. And then, like, let's just say there were blue, yellow, and orange or whatever. And then just up on the screen just goes, like, one small light, one small light, one small light with the noise. And then the thing starts. Like, if they had one, I think something like that.
We need to case study and get it out there. I mean, really, all it will take is their social media team in post-production, just making sure that sound was on in the background. Every video. Yeah. There you go. Free idea.
But again,
off you go.
Every brand, like, how considered was that choice of sound? Like, that could literally have been a chip or something that they used that just had that in it. Yeah. Like, and it could have been a team completely disconnected from anything to do with marketing. Could have been the manufacturers. They could sub out their manufacturing and this could just be the sound they have. And they don't even think like, oh, this is actually our Sonic logo. Like, do they even know that it's a Sonic
logo? It feels
logo?
very intentional, but then it's not in any of their marketing in the same way of like that direct
intentional, but it's
user to the marketing.
So it's like intentional in terms of the physicality of the product. Like, it is probably something to do with some sort of law that it has to have a sound. So they probably had to put one on in terms of like it turning on with it being some kind of aerial device. So I'm curious if they even know they have a Sonic logo ready to go. So George, back to the misconception before we wrap.
Have you
we don't need to think
me
about sound right now. Have I convinced you that that is not a misconception and people don't need to think about sound right now?
Still a big fat misconception in my world. I think brands are missing out big time.
Big time.
Big time. Anything else you want to say, Luke?
Goodbye.